I'm going to now finish off the session by talking about the financial crime prevention programs at ICA. So I think probably to begin with, we've heard from Jonathan about the GRC, and we've heard from Lee about the AML programs. The financial crime program, I think, is probably the widest in scope of all the ICA programs. So this program takes a holistic view of financial crime. So it covers fraud, it covers bribery and corruption, it covers market abuse, market fraud and insider dealing, cybercrime. It touches on AML, terrorist financing and sanctions, but at a higher level and in less detail than the AML qualifications. So one of the key debates for people often is which course is right for me. Is it FCP? Is it GRC? Is it AML? My advice would be all three are excellent qualifications, and a lot of it depends on where you're coming from professionally and where you want to go to professionally. Now, this course, the financial crime programs, will give you a broad range of options with a particular focus on financial crime. We know that the threat from serious and organised crime is evolving rapidly. So the National Crime Agency has just recently updated its top perceived threats to the UK, and the usual suspects are there: Class A drugs, people trafficking, fraud, child exploitation. You know, these are the consistent themes that run through the threats facing us. But we know organised crime has become more sophisticated. And this course equips you with an understanding of how organised crime, serious and organised crime, functions. A fascinating insight into the traditional definitions of organised crime, as well as the new evolving, more cellular, loosely affiliated types of organised criminal groups. Very important to understand your enemy. And we will equip you with that information on this program. In my career, previous to being an MRLO and head of financial crime, I looked at tax structures of organised crime groups and their structures. And the thing that is striking is just how organised criminal groups are. They use the very best professional enablers they can find. The best lawyers, the best accountants, and the number one thing these groups will do is seek to legitimise their assets. And we'll look at all of that on the program. Now, there is a particular focus now from regulators about firms protecting not just their bottom line, but protecting their customers and the wider society. So an example of this would be, the FCA recently, last few years, saying to investment banks, what are you doing to protect your customers from frauds that don't affect your bottom line? So many of you will have heard of boiler room frauds, carbon credit frauds, land banking. Don't know if you've come across that one. Land banking scams, where you get cold called and asked to invest in an undeveloped plot of greenbelt land. Now, these frauds may not target or may not affect your firm directly, but your customers are being actively targeted by organised criminals. What are you doing as a firm to protect your customers and society as a whole? And that is another theme that's very topical at the moment. We know the range of risks in financial crime prevention is escalating. Did you see the news yesterday, the day before? There's a huge news story about the government's changing focus on economic and financial crime. What am I talking about? So you all know about the Bribery Act. I'm guessing most of you do. The Bribery Act is an interesting piece of legislation because it imposes a corporate offence, doesn't it? It says if you're a firm and your staff members or anyone associated with your firm pays a bribe or receives a bribe anywhere in the world, your firm commits a criminal offence. What is the defence for the firm, however? The firm has a defence to that, doesn't it? What is the defence? Does anyone know? Yeah, you have adequate systems. You can evidence that you trained staff. You can evidence that you had a risk assessment. You can evidence that senior management were engaged in anti-bribery and corruption. You can evidence that you vetted your third parties. So I train a lot of oil and gas companies. I can tell you, BP, for example, has over 1 million counterparties that they do business with around the world. BP spends a huge amount of time evidencing that they've done due diligence on those counterparties. How does your firm evidence this? Now, the Bribery Act is what it is. We've had it since 2010. The government has announced a new criminal offence, facilitating tax evasion. Not only that, the proposal now is to bring in new corporate offences for failing to stop your staff committing fraud, for failing to stop your staff facilitating money laundering, for failing to stop your staff breaching sanctions. So you're going to see a massive increase in firms revisiting their systems and controls. So we will be talking about this changing regulatory landscape, and there's a huge amount of change in financial crime coming. Huge amount. So, to run you through what the program covers, understanding financial crime risks. How do organised criminals work? How do corrupt politicians work? At the risk of going off into a rant, I'm extremely frustrated with the current state of play in this country about the way we deal with corruption. Some of you will be aware one of David Cameron's parting acts was to sanction a piece of legislation that effectively says, take it easy on PEPs. You all know PEPs, politically exposed persons. These poor old individuals who are in the House of Lords or slumbering in the backbenches of Parliament, the banks have been awfully mean and cruel and asked them embarrassing questions about the source of their wealth, the source of their funds, etc., because they are PEPs. The UK government has passed a law which now requires the FCA to give guidance to banks about how to go easy on domestic PEPs effectively, to make sure you don't ask them too many embarrassing questions, you don't overdo it. And what's more, we must bring in a formal complaint process for these poor old politicians if they feel embarrassed. Now, I think we've got someone from the FOS here, haven't we? Financial Ombudsman Service. So forgive me, is there not already a complaint system in this country? Anyway, the point is, while this wonderful, brave new piece of legislation has been passed, the amount of illicit capital hemorrhaging out of developing countries is getting worse year after year after year. What, 10% at least, according to some of the recent figures. And where is a lot of that illicit capital still flowing? As Lee mentioned, it's flowing into London and the wider UK. That is what we should be stopping, not worrying about some old duffer in the House of Lords being slightly embarrassed. I told you I was going to go into a rant. That's it, over. Sorry, calm down. Lee's telling me to calm. Right. But the point is we will look at some of these risks, some of the theories around financial crime. We'll look at, I think, a very interesting area, the behavioural and psychological profiling of criminals. Now, you may say, well, this is all very interesting, it's very theoretical. The largest ever internal fraud I dealt with was a multi-million-dollar pound, I should say, procurement fraud. And the classic behavioural characteristics were all there. They were all there. So while you might say, yeah, this is interesting, this case study is very interesting, my goodness, the themes that we learn about on this course are real and they work. And we will talk about how to take those profiling approaches and embed them in your controls. Very interesting, understanding how fraudsters, criminals, and corruption as well takes hold. We'll look at specific fraud typologies. The course is designed to appeal to both the regulated sector and the public sector and non-regulated. So, for example, we look at business frauds. Has anyone here heard the term teaming and lading? Yeah? So teaming and lading is a very common fraud around invoicing and receiving payments. The term comes from the days when coal used to be delivered around on carts and streets. And the workmen delivering the coal, as they went past their house, would throw off a few bags of coal. But because there was so much demand for this coal, the carts were going 24 hours a day, and the sacks that were being thrown off were not missed. And this fraud still exists, but it exists in the modern commercial context. We'll talk about procurement fraud. We'll talk about HR frauds. Okay, we'll talk about all of those frauds and how to combat them. But we'll also talk about financial services frauds. We're going to have a look at an example in a minute, mortgage fraud, which is a topic very dear to my heart. I've done a lot of work on fighting mortgage fraud, and we can learn a lot from what the financial services industry has done well and spectacularly failed to do in the last 10 years on mortgage fraud. Credit card fraud, banking fraud. You know, I could bore you with the various types of frauds we'll look at. Bust-out fraud, many of you will have heard of that. You know, what I would call a lulling fraud. The fraudster lulls a bank into a sense of complacency. This is a good customer. This customer is transacting normally. We're going to give them some more facilities, credit, overdraft. The minute that's given by the bank systems, they bust out and they max out their overdraft, write out loads of checks and disappear. And we'll talk about all these different frauds and how they work, okay? Bribery and corruption, fascinating subject. I think probably one of the most important subjects the ICA speaks about. Now, we do have a lot of focus on this, both in terms of systems and controls, and also the concept of extraterritorial law. So we look very much at the US approach to ABC as well, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We look at what scenarios actually look like. And the real risk for me with bribery and corruption is not what everyone gets hung up on, which is gifts and hospitality. The real risk is your third-party relationships. That's where the vast majority of significant bribery cases hit. So how do you manage those relationships with those middlemen, those people who are out there winning deals on your behalf? And we'll talk about that a lot on the course. Very interesting area. We'll look at some of the massive corporate frauds in the past 10, 15 years. What is striking when you actually look at the academic research into big corporate business frauds, you know, you'll have all heard the roll call of infamy, Parmalat, Enron, WorldCom, and the striking thing is, in all of these frauds, there are themes, aren't there? Consistent themes. The failure of internal and external auditors to do their job properly. Bizarre, strong, aggressive personalities. Sounds a cliche. It's like reading a fraud textbook, isn't it? We've all probably worked with difficult, awkward people, Lee, haven't we? But we know that difficult, awkward people sometimes are difficult and awkward for a reason. And we'll look at quite a few case studies highlighting that fact. One of my personal favourites is a case we look at involving a gentleman called John Rusnak. I don't know if you're familiar with this case. If you're ever going to have to give a training course on what to look for with fraud, this case has it all, okay? This is a guy that became the golden boy of AIB Bank, Forex dealer. And his career was based on a fraud. He lied. His basic theory was that the US dollar would fall against the Japanese yen. And he dressed it up with a load of smoke and mirrors, but that's basically what his trading strategy was. And for a while, the markets went in his favour. And he made a vast amount of money for his bank. But then the market started to turn. And rather than accept those losses, he had faked all his hedging deals. In fact, when they eventually arrested him, the FBI, they found a laptop with a folder on it, you know, the little folder icon, and it was headed up fake docs. And what he'd done is he'd gone to a mailboxes, etc. shop, you know, those little shops you can go into, and he'd hired a fax machine using a fake passport. And he was faxing through faked up headed sheets from other firms confirming his hedged deals. So while the bank's risk exposure apparently was here, because the hedging deals didn't exist, their risk exposure was here. Now, the compliance function, the auditors, 13 times they picked up inconsistencies with his paperwork, problems with his behaviour, his aggressive behaviour, and they escalated that 13 times to senior management. Now, who did senior management side with? Did they side with the compliance function, or did they side with the golden boy? Who do you think? The golden boy. And after a while, the compliance function gave up. Okay? Now, we're going to look at maybe some of the challenges there, but that case has got everything. It's got the personality, it's got the bullying. He convinced his IT department to put his trading software on his laptop so he could trade from home. Now, we'll look at IT controls and separation of duties, all of these fraud controls, but we'll anchor them back into case studies in the practical real world. Because you will read some of these case studies and you will not believe them, but they happen again and again. Year after year, we see the same patterns, and we learn from them, or we should learn from them, okay? So, very interesting area. Electronic crime and data security. I know somebody who every Friday, her job involves going out, standing in the parking lot of her office and watching as the shredding people shred the paper. Does anyone else have to do this? That's exciting. That is data security, isn't it? I train in different buildings all around the world. Some buildings, I can stroll in. When I finish training, they say, oh, thanks, Becca, you can show yourself out. And I'm just left to frolic barefoot through fields of customer data, frolicking merrily as I go. Other firms, it takes me 45 minutes to get in the door, through security checks. You yourself see this. I'm sure you see inconsistencies in your own building sometimes. But we'll talk about physical security. We'll talk about data security, laptops, encryption, all of those issues, changing access rights, levers, joiners and levers. I won't name the bank. One of the banks I used to work for, I went back about a year after I'd finished with them, and they said to me, oh, Becca, you do know, only last week we found out you had the authority to write cheques out up to £1 million. And I said, if only you told me. I wouldn't have been here, I tell you, I would have been on a beach somewhere. That's my advice from doing this course, by the way. If you're going to do it once, do it big, and go somewhere with no extradition treaty and a nice beach. Okay? No, strike that from the record, Phil. That's not official ICA policy. But in all seriousness, we do look at how these people think. Okay? And electronic crime and data security is a core part of this. So part of the course is looking at the emerging, what are called vectors of electronic crime. So what we're not doing on this course is giving you in-depth IT knowledge, but we're giving you enough knowledge to ask the right questions of the IT guy. So I'll give you an example. So, for example, some of you will be involved in migration of systems, maybe, as a financial crime practitioner in your firm. So maybe you have a new client relationship management system being imported into your firm. You need to be right at the heart of that process. So when a consultant comes in from an IT background and tells you that they have to run a test on the data, your job is to say, do you really need live customer data? What access will you have? How will we monitor what this consultant does? Because there have been so many examples of people abusing those access rights. So you need to know to ask the right questions. And we look at things like the growth of cloud computing. We look at what we call naive users. Have any of you heard the term wetware? So we have hardware, we have software. We also have something called wetware. Anyone heard that term? What is wetware, do you think? It's people. People, and they are your biggest risk. You can have all the IT training and infrastructure and firewalls and corporate governance, but if your human beings do something stupid, everything will fall down. And that is so common, and we'll look at that risk as well and how we can try and mitigate that, okay? We'll talk about what happens if you have a cyber attack. What systems of control should you have in place? We'll look at the growth of DDoS, Distributed Denial of Service Attacks. You may have heard of something called the Low Impact Ion Cannon. Don't know if you've heard of this. Free bit of software that was pushed out at the time of the banking crisis. Anonymous were promoting it. 5 minutes in your bedroom, you can download it, you type in a URL, and it floods that URL with spam emails. You don't need any IT skill to use that tool. That's what we're dealing with. Script kiddies is the term. Someone who just is bored, downloads someone else's malicious software, and just uses it without any necessarily particularly in-depth IT knowledge. So we'll talk about those risks as well. And then finally, we look at if you do suffer loss, how do you go about working with law enforcement? How do you go about recovering? Because the figures are really depressingly low. Something like a fraud, roughly 13% of money that's lost through fraud is ever recovered. And of that 13%, some of that is insurance. That includes, your insurance. So we talk about trying to improve those odds in your favour as well. How do you work with law enforcement to get an effective outcome? So again, as Jonathan and Lee have mentioned, the qualifications really range from entry level, so fundamentals of financial crime, what is fraud, what is the legal concepts, the basics, what is bribery, right up to advanced and we have the postgraduate diploma in financial crime compliance as well. So, just to give you a little bit more examples here, we've already heard a little bit about virtual currency. So we'll look at the growth of virtual currency and where it's going. I had the privilege of meeting a law enforcement officer who was the lead expert and author of the UK's National Risk Assessment for Money Laundering, looking at virtual currencies. And his concern is that the majority of Bitcoin that's in circulation is not in active circulation, it's just sat as a store of value. And a lot of that store will be held by organised crime. Now, there's not a much empirical evidence to date of virtual currencies being used for money laundering, but we know it's happening. I already have talked to several officers who are seeing virtual currencies as active parts of fraud investigations, money laundering inquiries. Terrorist financing, we know, again, according to the UK's National Risk Assessment, there's no direct evidence yet of ISIS using virtual currency, but we know that they have mentioned they're looking at it. There's a young lad in the US went to prison for publishing an online guide to raising money for jihad using virtual currencies. You know, these people are not stupid, they're very technologically astute. We know they manipulate social media with great aplomb, so of course they're looking at it. Now, what's interesting is, forgive me, Tariq, for mentioning Deloitte, but they did a very good report a few months ago about the future of virtual currencies. And the consensus of that report was virtual currencies are going to go mainstream. Now, if I asked you the question, in this room, who here has ever bought anything with a virtual currency? If you wouldn't mind just putting up your hand if you have. We've got one. Okay. So, I suspect if I ask that question in 5 years' time, we're going to see half the room put their hands up. Why might I be saying that? Well, we know leading financial institutions are trialling and exploring their own virtual currencies. Citibank has something in development called the Citicoin, which uses, I believe it uses Ripple technology, which is one of the other virtual currencies out there. The government of Iceland has issued something called the Aurora, okay, state-backed virtual currency. There's talk of the Fed coin. The UK government, again, put out a call for information saying, what should we do with virtual currency? And the UK government is minded at the moment to be supportive, UK PLC to be supportive. There are different people out there. There are people that say virtual currency is a license to buy illicit substances on the internet and a cloak for criminality. And there are people who say virtual currencies are a fantastic blow for civil liberties, commercial growth and opportunity and flexibility. And there are people in the middle. What's going to happen if Google launch a Google coin, Apple launch an Apple coin? We're going to see step change here. And this course will explore where we're going today. So what is the regulation currently around virtual currencies? How do virtual currencies work? What are the risks around fraud, financial crime, money laundering, terrorist financing? And where are we going? Because, boy, we're moving quickly on this road. And I know when I talk to people about virtual currencies, they get confused, sad, worried, anxious, because it is complicated. But we will give you those tools to ask the right questions. So, cybercrime, I don't want to say too much about this, very interesting area. We look at everything from the human element to malicious denial of service attacks, and we talk about the practical approach. And again, if you're not an IT specialist, don't worry, we give you case studies on the questions to ask your IT guys and how to build in good financial crime practices around cybercrime. Very, very interesting area. Mortgage fraud, I've mentioned. This is an example of the sort of exercise you might see. So we look at, at the height of the banking crisis, we know that a lot of it was driven by mortgage fraud. In fact, many people believe it's the main driver for the credit crunch. We know that the banks have all lost hundreds of millions of pounds from organised mortgage fraud. You go to any big city in the UK, you will see a big tower, new build development. You know the sort of place, you see them advertised with the billboards, don't you? There's always a handsome male model, he's in his pyjamas, he's reading the paper, and there's a glamorous woman squeezing orange juice in the background, fresh orange juice, you know what I'm talking about? This is the aspirational inner city living. Behind that billboard, however, you will now find semi-derelict, half-tenanted buildings populated by all sorts of interesting characters. Okay? Now, we know that those buildings have been used on a huge scale by organised mortgage fraud rings. And the thing about mortgage fraud we can learn from is the targeted and systematic way they exploited the weaknesses in the financial system, because they knew enough about those weaknesses. And the banks were way too slow to respond. So we learn a lot about the concept of plausibility testing, getting your staff to think more critically, because so many firms have fallen into the trap of getting staff to follow box ticking, process diagrams. When you actually step back and look at your 18-year-old customer who is buying their first house in Edinburgh, but they live at home with mum and dad in London, and they're a self-employed IT consultant earning £120,000 a year, you would think that would cause a bank to stop, wouldn't you? And say, what's going on here? Wasn't always the case. And we'll talk about everything from that boring old subject, management information. How do you spot these fraud attacks before they explode? How do you train your staff? What judgments do you need to make? How do you retrospectively look for fraud and financial crime attacks? How do you verify the other people you're dealing with, like lawyers and accountants, to make sure they're not bad people? How do you share intelligence with other firms and regulators and law enforcement? Again, I wish I had more time to talk to you, but a big focus of the course is about sharing intel. And there's a lot of work going on at the moment, isn't there, sharing financial crime intelligence in the UK. We talk about that on the course as well. Just briefly then, I know Andy's down here as well, and Andy Clark can talk to you about this qualification as well. The Advanced Certificate in Fraud Management. This is one of our new courses, a mid-level qualification focused on the practical elements of fraud prevention, full of really interesting artifacts and case studies, looking at how to investigate fraud, how to respond to fraud, and how to make sure your controls are appropriate. Really, really interesting and innovative program. So I don't want to say too much about that really, but a fantastic new program. Again, the syllabi are all available for these programs online, and I believe you have materials as well. So again, we have them at various levels. So again, if you're agonising over which level is right for me, please do talk to myself or my colleagues from ICT and ICA, and we can give you lots of information on that as well.